the more that Zelensky can demonstrate to normal Russians that they're in a war, that this isn't just some foreign foray, that actually they are directly being affected, whether it's their young men predominantly and women being returned in boxes or without limbs, whether it's people being evacuated from the Kursk region, 150,000 people, they're going to talk as well. And all the sanctions, I think it all starts to pile up and potentially erode support for Putin.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hanson, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by the former fighter pilot, military analyst and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast, Sean Bell. Sean, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you, James. Always a pleasure to be here.
It's really interesting. So when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, the Kursk incursion was in its early phase. You were seriously impressed by the Ukrainian operation, but you were sceptical about how long they'd be able to maintain their position in Kursk. Have you changed your view on that?
No, I don't. I think when we first saw it start, it looked like about 1,000 troops, about 20 tanks, and it looked like just a probing attack, see how far they could go, ideally probably to embarrass and humiliate President Putin. But they managed to roll back the Russian defences pretty quickly. So they capitalised. It now looks likely to have 10,000 troops in that little enclave. It looks like they've blown 3 bridges. If they were planning to go any further, they wouldn't have blown those bridges. So it looks likely they're settling in and digging themselves in. The real surprise is why President Putin doesn't appear to have done anything about it. I think when we discussed before, one of the options was Putin, because he's Mr. Security, he would need to be seen to be dealing with this incursion firmly. I mean, let's be blunt. It's the first time that Russia's been invaded since 1941. So for a man who presents himself as Mr. Security, this is deeply humiliating. So the question is, why has he not reacted so far? And I think what's been interesting, a couple of answers to that. One of them, I come from military, where we delegate down. So from our junior non-commissioned ranks, our corporals, our senior non-commissioned ranks, our sergeants, they are empowered to take control in a world of ambiguity. They understand commander's intent. When things happen that are a surprise, they get on and do something about it. Whereas in the Russian military, that's not the way they operate. Any surprises, they look to their boss and say, what do I do now, boss? Their bosses look to their bosses, and it cascades all the way up. In this case, almost certainly to President Putin. And that leads to a sort of strategic paralysis on the front line until the boss, President Putin, decides what to do. I still think there are 2 options, one of which is to crush the Ukrainians that are there. And that would take battle-hardened troops. Russia would have to move them from the front line. That would ease pressure on the front line. And that's exactly what Ukraine is probably hoping it'll do. The other option, which I think is playing out at the moment, is Russia has fixed 10,000 of Ukraine's best fighters in a portion of Russia. He doesn't have to do anything about it now. He can put a ring of steel around it, deal with that another day. Meanwhile, as a military guy, you're always focused on main effort. And what appears to be Russia's main effort is the special military operation, seize Crimea, the land bridge, and the Donbass. He's done most of that. There's a small area of the Donbass, relatively small, he hasn't yet taken. It looks like Putin is doubling down on that. Pokrovsk, Toretsk are the 2 areas of focus. And that means he's got 10 to 12 weeks this summer before the winter settles in. It becomes much more difficult to fight. And that's what appears to be what Putin is doing at the moment.
And it's interesting as well, he's got his mate Lukashenko in Belarus to assemble some troops on the border with Ukraine in Gomel Oblast of Belarus. So again, that's probably designed to try and divert some Ukrainian troops up there as well?
It could be. I have to say, having been watching this closely for the full scale of the war, you'll recall early on in the war, Russia had positioned troops in Belarus, and there were suggestions that they'd be mounting attacks out of Belarus. And actually using the Belarusian soldiers as part of that attack. The trouble is, Lukashenko is known as the last dictator in Europe. And it was pretty clear at the time that the Belarusian military said, this is not our war. We're not going to follow you in there. And if you do, that would cause all sorts of unrest and potentially lead to the end of Lukashenko. So I suspect Ukraine has discounted that as a serious threat. What Lukashenko is probably trying to do is he wants to be a buddy to President Putin. He wants to demonstrate that he's doing all he can by putting troops at the border. It just puts a little bubble of doubt in President Zelensky's mind, he's probably got to do something with his resources just to cover off that risk, even though it's very unlikely those troops would actually come in.
And Putin, of course, hates to feel impotent ever. Does that explain what we've seen in recent days with these large-scale drone and missile attacks on towns and cities across Ukraine? Because he's so far unable to drive Ukraine out of Kursk. What can he do? He can launch this bombardment.
It could be, James, and that's very definitely one of the explanations for it. It could be a sort of act of petulance. I can't do this. I'll do something over here. I have to say that what Putin's done very effectively over the last few months, he's got very few long-range missiles left. He's buying them from North Korea and from Iran, and his defence industrial base is spinning up. So he can't afford to waste the missiles he has. So even an act of petulance, I'm not sure he'd do that. I think what's more likely, he does appear to be very focused on the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. Now, in the previous 2 autumns, that's exactly what Russia's done, because it's fearsomely cold in Ukraine over the winter, make life thoroughly miserable for Ukrainians and potentially therefore undermine their spirit, their will to fight. This is a bit early for that. What almost certainly this is about is that Ukraine has famously said it wants to deliver 1 million drones out of its own defence industrial base each year. And they are producing some very effective drones. They are having an impact in Russia. And as a result, it looks likely that Putin's stepping up the attack on the energy infrastructure, because if you take away the power, then the factories can't work. And if the factories can't work, they can't deliver this battle-winning equipment to Ukraine. So whilst it might be an act of frustration from President Putin, and I've no doubt that is a factor in this, the way he's conducting the attack does appear to be coherent with a continued effort to undermine the defence industrial base of Ukraine.
And President Zelensky has promised a response in turn. What do you think that could be? Could that be further drone attacks on Moscow? I mean, we've seen them in recent weeks. That would fit in with the wider strategy of trying to take the war to Russia.
It could be, James, but I think what President Zelensky's got to be very careful to do is to play this on his own terms. Classically, Russia is the larger combatant here. They've got more resources available, got greater wealth available, a bigger defence industrial base, more soldiers. So if Ukraine was simply to meet Russia on the battlefields of old and slug it out, Russia would win. So Ukraine has to find innovative ways to fight the battle. And that's what they're doing with this incursion. It's militarily, it doesn't actually make a great deal of sense, because you're diverting troops away from the main effort. Why would you do that? Politically, it plays to the centre of gravity of President Putin. Centres of gravity being things that the one of the combatants just doesn't want to lose. And if Putin knows he's actually put in power by the oligarchs, the power base, if they think there's any chance of this war being lost, they are not currently able to holiday in Paris. They're not able to go across to London. There's all sorts of sanctions crippling their business, and Putin is now indicted by the International Criminal Court. The more that Zelensky can demonstrate to normal Russians that they're in a war, that this isn't just some foreign foray, that actually they are directly being affected, whether it's their young men predominantly and women being returned in boxes or without limbs, whether it's people being evacuated from the Kursk region, 150,000 people, they're going to talk as well. And all the sanctions, I think it all starts to pile up and potentially erode support for Putin.
Well, let's pick up on that. How would you assess the strength of his position domestically currently?
It's a very, very good question, James, and I'm impossibly ill-equipped to answer that. I think what we have seen in history is that dictatorial leaders get very, very swiftly replaced. It doesn't end well generally for dictatorial leaders. I think we saw with Yevgeny Prigozhin, who rode a tide, it felt, of public opinion that managed to get him further to Moscow than many would have expected. Putin will be worried about that. It's very difficult when Putin controls all the information, and largely for domestic Russians, it's a bit like in this country, you might have strong political views, but frankly, as long as it doesn't affect what you do each day, you get up, look after your kids, go down the pub, you don't really mind who's in power. Likewise in Russia, they'll believe whatever they're fed as long as they can get on with their lives, bring up their families in some sort of security. But over time, gradually, the narrative that Putin's coming out with does not connect with the number of people coming back in body bags that they're having to bury. Everybody will know somebody in a body bag. By way of context, in the Afghanistan war in the UK, only a few hundred were killed, several thousand were badly injured. But Help for Heroes created a huge bow wave across the country of sympathy for our servicemen and women. Just imagine multiplying that by 100, maybe 1,000. That's the impact this is having in domestic Russia. So all of this is gradually nibbling away at Putin's power base. When will it crumble? Who knows? But history shows these are often short, sharp shocks rather than through a process of osmosis.
That's a really good point. And you've also got the issue of not just people coming home in body bags, but also people being displaced from their homes and being evacuated in Belgorod and in Kursk as well. If you were General Siersky then, if you were the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's forces, what would you do now? Would you try and consolidate the land you've taken in Kursk? Or would you, in a few weeks' time or whenever, try and stage a tactical withdrawal?
Yeah, and that's a big question, isn't it? The problem with answering that question, James, is that you have to set that into the context of that's a tactical issue in a whole strategy for the country. If you look at it from a grand strategic perspective, the Ukrainian counteroffensive penciled in for last year didn't really work. Lots of Western support didn't work. This year, the much vaunted $60 billion of US aid that was meant to come in didn't. That left a hole. Russia got on the front foot. And bluntly, it was always going to be a very difficult summer for Ukraine. And that is where we stand at the moment. Ukraine is on the back foot. Russia is grinding forward. Yes, there's the Kursk intrusion. Yes, there are oil refineries in flames. You know, they've been having effect inside Russia. But bluntly, where it matters on the front line, Ukraine have been struggling. I think Siersky would be very keen to stabilize the front line, get to winter, and try then to consolidate and actually get back on the front foot again. I think what's been interesting, many of the briefings I get from defense officials and colleagues in Ukraine, is that neither side really has the capability for a decisive breakthrough this year. Russia, bluntly, has been losing at times up to 1,600 servicemen a day. Compare that with the battles of last year, Bakhmut particularly. Well, that was less than 1,000 a day, and that was described as the most brutal battle since World War II. So 1,600 a day is far more. And even now, Russia is losing over 1,000 a day. Why does that matter? Well, Russia does not want to mobilize again. That would have a profound implication for Putin's power base. He has been trying to recruit people from overseas with a big bounty and lots of money salary-wise. Initially, that worked, but a lot of them were sent straight to the front line and got killed. Funny old thing, far significantly fewer are now recruiting, less than 1,000 a day. So Russia is not sustainable position in terms of manpower. Neither is Ukraine. Both sides are grinding themselves to a bit of a stalemate this year. In the absence of any breakthrough, I suspect it'll be winter when everybody will have a little catch their breath. Unfortunately, that times with the US presidential elections. And if President Trump arrives, then I suspect President Putin will be rubbing his hands in glee to see if there's some sort of deal to be done.
I suppose on the manpower thing, there's a couple of things to note. First of all, not that it affects the numbers, but there has been a pretty transformative effect to Ukrainian morale with the Kursk incursion. It's given them hope again. And also, a lot of the people fighting, being captured, being killed on the Russian side in Kursk are conscripts, because you can't send conscripts overseas. And whereas there are ex-prisoners, convicts, and migrants dying on the front line in Ukraine, when you've got conscripts who are very often the sons of middle-class families in Moscow and St. Petersburg dying, that changes the political equation. And then if Putin decides, well, maybe in order to solve my manpower problems, I'm looking at another mobilization, you can see the logic in that, but that also carries massive political risks, Sean.
You're absolutely right, James. I mean, you're absolutely right about the morale piece. The Kursk incursion, undoubtedly, not just for the frontline troops, but fellow Ukrainians. I was speaking to one Ukrainian journalist last week, and they said, somewhat with tongue-in-cheek, I can't wait to see a Ukrainian flag planted in Moscow. Now, of course, probably more in hope than expectation. But I wouldn't underestimate that it's been an incredibly difficult year, and therefore things like that have a huge morale fill up. But I do wonder militarily, I think, as you say, there's two sides to the Kursk invasion. From a military perspective, Ukraine has said they don't want to hold the ground, and actually they can't afford to lose 10,000 troops and all the equipment that comes with it. That will be a significant chunk of capability. So either you're planning to go further, you create longer logistics tails, and that's very difficult to support and much easier for Russia to attack. Unlikely to do that. You could hold your ground because the longer you're there, the more embarrassing it is for President Putin. Or, as you say, at some stage, you withdraw, and President Putin then looks across the rest of the border, over 1,000 miles of border between Russia and Ukraine, and goes, where are they going to strike next? And it's really interesting maths then. Even if you put one troop every 6 feet, which is a pretty sparsely populated, that's 1,000 troops a mile. That's, a million troops required just to protect the border. And that's only one every 6 feet. That isn't going to protect the border. So the implications for Russia to provide robust border security far outweigh Putin's ability to actually provide it. So what it has done with Ukraine's attack is it's sown a seed of doubt. Unfortunately, I think historians are going to look back on this period and write some interesting books about the strategy. Was it folly by President Zelensky, or was it a masterstroke that helped bring down Putin? Difficult to assess today. Be fascinating to look back at this period.
And do you think, Sean, we will see at some point further cross-border raids by Ukraine into Russia?
I think it's inevitable. I do think that, in fact, I'd be quite surprised if they're not happening already. There's been some articles appeared over the last 48 hours about special operations executives, the name that was given in World War II to areas that were occupied where, resistance fighters operated both within Ukraine, occupied Ukraine, and also in Russia. I suspect there's a continued theme here of making life as unpleasant as possible for Russia. And of course, once Russia realizes that it can't protect its borders, that has strategic. The number one priority of any political master is to protect your people. If you can't do that, real questions start to get asked. Why are we in Ukraine? All of a sudden, more and more people are talking, more and more dissent. That is very difficult for Putin to manage. We're not there yet. I'm not suggesting there's going to be a big coup, but I am suggesting it's just consistently undermining President Putin's position. And that'll be something that I suspect President Zelensky will be doing all he can. It's an asymmetric tactic. It plays to his strengths. I suspect we're going to see more of it.
And just finally, Sean, what do you think the appropriate response from the West should be? I'm increasingly of the view that one of the objectives of this incursion actually is to send a message from Ukraine to its Western allies of, look, we can physically invade Russia, and the worst case scenario of some drastic escalation and, God forbid, the use of tactical nuclear weapons by Putin in Ukraine won't come to pass. It hasn't come to pass so far. We don't want to be complacent, of course, but do you think that's part of the objective here? And if so, how should the West respond?
Once again, James, it could be. I think we've got to be quite careful, though, just because, Russia is a vast country. Although Ukraine has made an incursion, the area of ground it's taken is 0.0003% of Russian territory. So in grand strategic terms, it's tiny. It's not got any significant capability there, towns, cities, or whatever. So a lot of communities. So I'm not trying to underplay it, but it's not difficult terrain to take. And therefore, did they have to fight fierce battles to get in there? No. Did they have the element of surprise to take it? Yes. Is it an embarrassment for Putin? Yes. But I'm not sure that there are any big military lessons to learn from that at all. I think what's been interesting is that it has raised the question of these long-range missiles. You'll know that for the course of the war up to now, the West has been leaning forward, particularly the UK, in providing weapons. First of all, anti-tank weapons, then tanks, then long-range weapons, and then maybe we weren't providing F-16s. We've certainly provided a lot of the training for tens of thousands of the soldiers as well. And largely we've said to President Zelensky, once you've got it, as long as it's used within the limits of law of armed conflict, we don't mind how you use it. And in a way, Storm Shadow was the same. The trouble is now that Ukraine is operating within Russian territory. And the caveat there is that Putin always said, nuclear is the option if my territory is ever invaded. So Zelensky is calling that bluff, and that's a dangerous bluff to call. As soon as, my understanding is the US, as a leader in NATO, turned around to its fellow NATO colleagues and went, look, I know we're all doing our own thing supporting Ukraine, but actually, if we play into Putin's narrative that this isn't a war between Russia and Ukraine, it's actually a war between Russia and the West, or Russia and NATO, use of long-range weapons could tip that fine balance. So rather than individual nations making a decision, do you think it's prudent that we all sit down together and agree a policy? And that appears to be what's happened with those long-range missiles. I was doing an interview with a Ukrainian news, and they were saying, surely you should be more robust. And I said, be careful how you criticise. The UK is in a difficult position financially, domestically, but it's still providing a lot of support for Ukraine. We must be careful not to escalate this. It doesn't sound as if the West was expecting this incursion. We've got to be really careful not to play into Putin's hand. But so far, exactly as you described it, Putin's been saber rattling every step of the way, but it's starting to sound like crying wolf. But when you get so close to operating inside Russia, I think inevitably, internationally, it's prudent to tread carefully.
Sean, always great to chat. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome, James.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to The Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.